Hi there. Welcome to the Kessler Law Firm podcast. I'm your host, Michael Kessler, and I've been a criminal defense lawyer here on Florida's Treasure Coast for, well, I keep saying almost 40 years. It was 40 years ago today that I graduated law school. And 4 years, in 4 days, it'll be 4 years since my very first court appearance. Today, my brother Ken is visiting and is going to ask some questions that he thought you would like to know about my experience and my celebration of 40 years here on the Treasure Coast. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you very much. 40 years is a very significant milestone. And I know you're not one for making a big to-do about yourself, but I feel like it is a big to-do, and you've been around here for 40 years. So let's start with some of the basics. What brought you to Fort Pierce in 1985?
Well, funny story. Um, I was living with my new wife in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. We were living on campus in a tiny little married student housing apartment. And I was a third year law student, and she was working on campus at the law library. And my best friend, Mark, came to see me about, I don't know, 5, 6 days before spring break. And he was telling me that he was going to go to Florida over the weekend and interview with the public defender's office in some place called Stewart, Florida, which I had never heard of. He was going to go down for a week and he wanted to know if I wanted to go with him. During this time, Mark and I were both volunteer interns at the Chapel Hill Public Defender's Office, which meant we were glorified gophers. And we also drank a lot of beer together in those days. Well, I told Mark that I wasn't going to go with him because I kind of had a job lined up. I was then in negotiations with a small law firm whose offices were on the north side of Raleigh, actually about a mile from where you and our parents were living then. And we were just a few dollars apart, and I was willing to take what they were offering. I was just trying to do a little better. Well, Mark looked me square in the face and he said the words that no young man ever wants to hear. He said, "Mike, this is going to be the last spring break of your life." And that was enough to make me go in and talk to my wife and say, "Hey, listen, honey, I know you have to work next week because the law library is open and first and second year students have papers to write. I don't really have anything that I need to do. How would you feel if I went away for a week with Mark? He's going to Florida to interview with the public defender's office." And I won't tell you exactly what she said, but she said okay eventually. And so we're going to go to Florida. And the day before we were leaving, he dropped by my apartment again, and Mark said, "Hey, bring a jacket and tie. Maybe we'll go out somewhere nice." And I think, okay, fine. And I throw in a dress shirt and a sport jacket and a tie. And not thinking for a second, Ken, we're not going anywhere nice. We didn't have any money. In fact, we were taking the Amtrak from Raleigh to West Palm Beach and renting a car because neither one of us then owned a car we could trust to get all the way to Stewart and back. Well, of course, on the train, Mark talked me into interviewing with the public defender's office too. So I went in for my interview with a terrific guy named Robin Frierson, one of the best lawyers I've ever known. And Mark and I interviewed. He went first, and then I interviewed, and they only had one opening. And I said to Robin, "My friend Mark was born to defend the public. You all should hire him. Can I go now?" That's all I remember from the interview. The day after the interview, one of their interns failed the Florida bar for the second time. I should point out here that um, in Florida, if a law student works in a legal clinic while in law school, they can get certified to practice law for 1 year after graduation under the supervision of another lawyer. Well, the Florida bar exam is only offered twice a year. So when this lawyer, this intern, failed for the second time, her certification as an intern was going to run out before she could take the next bar exam. So suddenly they had two openings and they decided they wanted Mark and me both. So that's the message that was waiting for me when I got back home. And then I went in and said to the wife, hey, why don't I take this and we can go down to Florida and hang out at the beach for a year? I'll get some trial experience and then we can come back up here. And that was our plan. Mark and I flipped a coin and he took the opening in Stewart and I took the opening in Fort Pierce. And that's how we got down here.
And 1985 seems, well, I'm sure it seems like both yesterday and a long time ago to sort of set the time. Ronald Reagan was president. The Dow was around 1,500. Gas cost $1.20 a gallon. So it was kind of a different world. Do you remember when you got down here and you got into the public defender's office, what your first case was?
As a matter of fact, I do because it was funny to me. First of all, I showed up at the office 4 days after graduating law school. I hit the ground running. I get over there 8:30 in the morning on Thursday after Sunday's graduation, and they only trusted me with one file at a time. They sent me over to the courthouse. They had to give me directions to the courthouse because I didn't know where it was. And I had the pleasure of arguing a motion to compel Brady evidence from the last non-lawyer judge in Florida. Let me unpack all of that. First of all, based on a landmark US Supreme Court case called Brady versus Maryland, prosecuting attorneys have an affirmative obligation to disclose to the defense evidence that tends to exculpate an accused or prove that an accused is not guilty of what they're charged with. Evidence of an alibi, evidence that a witness is lying, evidence that a witness has a motive to lie, felony convictions, things of that nature. And somebody at the public defender's office thought in this particular case, the state had that something, we didn't have it, they hadn't disclosed it. So I was going to go over and ask the judge to order them to disclose it, make a finding that they had it, order them to disclose it, and put them on a deadline. Now, I said this was the last non-lawyer judge in Florida. Florida used to have one level of criminal trial courts, and stuff that was considered too small was assigned not to trial judges, but to a justice of the peace. It's like what we now call small claims court, and back then, misdemeanor court. In the early 70s, I think it was 73, Florida split the trial courts into two levels: circuit court, which handles felonies, and county court, which handles misdemeanors. They handle more than those things. Circuit court is for big civil suits. Family court is circuit court, juvenile court, probate court, other things where you really needed a veteran judge. County court was for less serious crimes, misdemeanors, and small claims. And so when Florida created this two-tiered system, they grandfathered in as county court judges all of the remaining justices of the peace. anybody that was going to become a new county court judge would have to be a lawyer and qualify and all that jazz. But they grandfathered in these JPs. And by the time I got down here 12 years later, a former car dealer by the name of Fast Eddie DeFriest was the last remaining non-lawyer judge, still sitting on the bench in Florida. Now, we had two county court judges then, and I'll tell you, I could tell you all kinds of stories. They did not like each other. But Judge DeFriest knew more law than the lawyer judge. But because he wasn't a lawyer, he felt free to ignore it when the law didn't fit his particular value system. He also believed in bullying lawyers, new lawyers especially, as a test. Actually, he bullied everybody, especially if they were new. A new police officer typically would get ordered to stand up in a chair in open court and explain to the audience why he became a police officer. Anyhow, I go over to argue this motion, and I argue it like a top drawer law student. I explained what I wanted. I explained why I believe the state had it. And I explained the authority of Brady versus Maryland. And I cited the volume and page of the Supreme Court reporter that had that case in black and white. And Judge DeFriest looked at me like I was some new species of cockroach that he hadn't seen before. And he said to me, "Son, I know you ain't from around here, but somebody needs to tell you that you ain't in Maryland." And based on that, he denied my motion. And then in classic Eddie DeFriest style, he leaned over and stared me right in the face while he said to the clerk, "Call the next case." And that was my very first experience as a real lawyer in Florida.
How long did you stay with the public defender's office?
Just over a year and a half, from mid-May of 85 until the end of 86. And then I
And
opened my own law practice.
what made you decide to open your own practice?
Well, I always intended to open my own law practice at some point. Um, I have joked over the years that my middle name is insubordinate. I have trouble working for other people. I like to be the guy calling the shots. I like to make the rules, set the policy. I also like to be able to change the policy. You've experienced this at the office. I may come in someday and say, okay, we're going to try do things a different way. We're going to do this. And by noontime, I will have realized that, okay, that was a bad idea. We're not going to do this anymore. One of the books you've seen on my shelf here is Sacred Cows Make the Best Burgers. It's a book that has taught me you don't keep doing something the way you've always done it if that's the only reason you're doing it that way. From time to time, you need to take a look at what you're doing and decide, am I doing this because it's the best way, or am I just doing it because I always have? That's why I always wanted to be my own boss. Now, at the public defender's office, I spent 8 or 9 months in the misdemeanor division, and I was in trial all the time. When I got promoted to the felony division, I spent another 8 or 9 months in felonies, and I only got one trial. And the main reason I was there was to get some experience. Well, I was getting no trial experience once they promoted me to felonies. And God knows they weren't paying me any money. So I went out on my own. And from the first year out, I made a better living than my friend Mark, who stayed.
Now, a lot has changed, of course, around Fort Pierce over the years. Shops and restaurants have come and gone. I think PJ Clark's and Crystal's were still downtown when you were getting started, right?
They were. We had several restaurants open and close as PJ Clark's. Um, for for the locals now, that sits where the Second Street Bistro now is. The Sunrise Theater had closed years before I came to town, and that was all office space. And in fact, at one point, my friend Cliff Barnes and I had the office suite overlooking the theater marquee. To
Nice.
the south end of the first floor offices was a diner called Crystal's, where everybody went. Everybody went there for breakfast. Everybody went there for lunch. Everybody went there in the afternoon for their famous pies. Nobody went there for dinner because they closed. And I think they closed at about 4. I think my friend Clay Yates actually has one of the counter stools from when they finally closed. Talked about changes. When I came to town, the courthouse, I'm pointing, it's across the street from my office. What locals today regard as the new wing of the courthouse is actually the original courthouse. And the main building that is perpendicular, that runs from Indian River Drive to Second Street, that's what I think of as the new courthouse, although it was built and opened probably 30 years ago. But when I was a rookie, I went in the courthouse where the law library sits and a bunch of the, well, I was going to say a bunch of the clerk's offices, but now they have their own building.
In addition to the courthouse, a lot of judges have come and gone over the years for a variety of reasons. In fact, there's one that's in the news right now. Can you talk about that?
Well, yeah, lots of judges have come and gone. Um, Many have retired. Many of those have passed on. A handful of county court judges have been voted out of office. Some lawyer has challenged them. And that's probably happened. Oh, I didn't count before we began today's talk, but I would guess about a dozen times over the 40 years that I've been here. Maybe not quite. Now, during that time, not one single circuit judge has lost an election, been voted out of office. There were some who had close races. I remember my friend Paul Kanarak had a scare one year. Some senior prosecutor ran against him, and it was neck and neck, but he was trailing most of the evening until the Martin County votes came in where he and his parents had grown up, and that carried him through. There was one judge who um, I used to regard as a nemesis. I actually liked the man, but didn't like the way he did his job. That was Larry Shack. Larry drew a challenger one year, and on the last day to qualify, he chose to retire instead, which was a surprise to all of us because she was a fairly young newcomer and he hadn't had any kind of a scandal or anything. So we expected him to win. Um, but yeah, judges have come and gone. Most recently, there's a story in today's paper about a judge, circuit level judge, who resigned after his recent DUI arrest. And I don't know any of the details other than what's been in the papers. So maybe there's more to the story. Who knows? Um, but about 10 years ago, one of our local county court judges uh, got charged with DUI. And I actually represented her. And it's ironic, being a judge, she knew all the lawyers in town. And she reached out to me because the year before I had tried a DUI case that was factually just like hers and got a not guilty verdict from the jury. Um, we ended up saving her judgeship, more her than me, but I helped. Um, we took care of the DUI case and we dealt with the Judicial Qualifications Commission Ultimately, she was given a reprimand, but that's all. And two or three lawyers challenged her when her seat was up the very next year. And all they said about anything was DUI, DUI, DUI. But she was a well respected judge and she won re-election and she kept her job until I think it was just last year that she retired.
Did you know Cliff Barnes before he was a judge?
Yes. In fact, Cliff Barnes was one of the very first lawyers outside the public defender's office that I met in the spring of '85 when I was new in town. He had only recently left, and so he was still friends with a lot of the lawyers that still work there. And in fact, Cliff's wife and a couple of the other public defenders' wives welcomed my wife into their circle, and they did a lot of things together while we were doing our gig. But yeah, I've known Cliff since May or June of '85. In fact, our kids are almost the same age. I think his firstborn was born in '85. That's summer. My firstborn was born the very next year. And then Cliff's second child, Jordan, was born in '87, and my youngest in '88. So our kids grew up knowing each other as well.
Any other judges that are particularly memorable for good or bad reasons?
For good or bad. Um, I will tell you, um, LB Vosell, Buck Vosell, was probably the kindest judge that I have ever met. And I won't say that I was one of his favorites. I mean, I'd like to think so, but I probably wasn't. He was nice. He was kind to everybody. He did me a favor that taught me that you could say no to a judge. A couple of months into my career as a private attorney, he called me and asked me if I would accept a court appointment to represent a death row inmate in a clemency petition. Clemency is where you ask the governor and his cabinet, who are the clemency board in Florida, to commute a condemned person's sentence from the death penalty to life without parole or life with parole, as we had it back then. And since I didn't know you could, I said, of course, I'd never heard of this defendant because I didn't grow up or go to school down here. Well, it turned out to be a fellow named David Allen Gore, who was a serial killer. So, needless to say, I didn't succeed in getting him off death row. Um, but years after that, I was representing a fella in a four co-defendant murder case. And the prosecutor had made a deal with the other three defendants to point my guy as the shooter. These four guys lived on the south side of Fort Pierce, near where Farmers Market Road is today. And together they drove in a van all the way past Fort Pierce, past Lakewood Park, past Vero Beach, all the way to Sebastian, where they barged in the door of a local marijuana dealer and executed him in front of his 6-year-old child and his 18-year-old girlfriend. And we were set for trial. And it was clear to me that I was either going to get a not guilty verdict or he was going to get the chair. And the Friday before Monday's jury selection, the prosecutor and I reached agreement on a settlement that both sides could live with. My client was not only going to avoid a death sentence, but he was going to avoid a life sentence as well. We negotiated a deal to plead a second-degree murder for a term of years. And the judge wanted to take the plea right away. And the prosecutor said that her victim's family couldn't get to court during the day Friday. And could we just do it Monday morning? Judge Vosell said, can they get here at 7 o'clock Friday evening? And she said yes. And he required the clerks and the bailiffs, all the court personnel, to be back at 7, and had a session of night court, which all these years later, we still don't have night court around here. We conducted night court, and he accepted my client's no contest plea to the amended charge of second-degree murder, sentenced him to a term of years. And in fact, my client's now out of prison all these years later. At the end of that court hearing, Judge Vosell invited me back into chambers because he wanted to tell me why we did night court. And he said, Mike, when I was a young lawyer, I was in exactly your position. And I made a deal that would have saved my client's life, just like you did. And the judge was too busy to hear the plea on Friday and wasn't interested in night court and set it for Monday morning. And the judge told me that over the weekend, other inmates, you may have heard the term jailhouse lawyers, other inmates talked his client out of the plea. And on Monday morning, he refused to take the deal. The case went to trial. He was convicted, sentenced to death, and executed. And Judge Vosell looked at me and he said, I didn't know back then I would ever be a judge, but I decided right then and there, if I ever was a judge, I would never put another lawyer in the position that that judge put me. That's just one example of what a nice, kind-hearted human being Judge Vosell was. And it was a real tragedy. He retired so that he and his wife could travel. And very soon after he retired, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and he passed away not long after that. His son, who we also call Buck, is a prominent lawyer in Vero. He may have retired by now, but Judge Vosell's probably, he's the one that sticks out the most. Lots of judges taught me a great deal over the years. Jimmy Medelis, who we lost a year or two ago, he's the judge who took over when Judge DeFriest, Fast Eddie, retired. And Judge Medelis was a stickler for procedure, and he taught me a lot about how to be a real lawyer. Because he expected if you showed up in his courtroom, you were there on time, you knew what you were doing, and you were ready to handle your case. Otherwise, he didn't want you in his courtroom. He also had a great staccato laugh that you could hear down the street. Gosh, I've probably have practiced in front of, easily 100 judges, maybe 200 different judges. You know that I take cases all over the place. So it hasn't been just my local judges. And I genuinely like most of them. I don't always like the way they run their courtrooms, but that's the breaks. They don't always like the way I handle my cases either. But as I told my friend Judge Yakuchi, who's also now retired, I told him over a beer one night, I don't work for you. You have your job to do. I have my job to do, but pleasing you is not my job. If I can do my job and please the judge too, great. But doing my job that's what's important.
Any idea, even a ballpark on how many cases and or clients you've had over the 40 years?
No idea. I've never kept track of that. I don't know how many trials I've done. I know that I've been board certified for close to 20 years, maybe more than 20 years by now. And in order to apply for board certification, you had to have 25 jury trials. And to get recertified, you have to have 5 or 6 during every recertification period. I'm sure I've tried well over 100 cases, but most cases don't go to trial. And I would guess I've handled thousands, but I've never thought that was something important to count.
On TV, you always see the lawyers talking about their win-loss records, and I think that's just a TV thing.
Yeah, one of my favorite TV lawyers was Denny Crane, played by William Shatner. And every room he went into, he would just say, Denny Crane. And for a while, I used to do that too, mocking him, and my lawyer friends would all laugh. Um, the storyline, the backstory for his fictional character is that he'd never lost a case. I remember one of my mentors telling me, "You're not a real trial lawyer until you lose 8 or 10 in a row." Well, I've never lost 8 or 10 in a row, but I certainly don't win every case. I never had. I did once have a string of 8 consecutive not guilty verdicts in felony court. And I only know that number because I told the same story during closing argument 8 trials in a row and got 8 straight not guilties. So for a while, I was known for telling the spaghetti and meatballs story in closing. That's a story for another day because it takes a while to set that up.
There's a video for anybody that's interested. There is a video on Mike's YouTube channel where he does go into depth on that, so you can find that. Are there any particular cases or clients that really stand out from the 40 years?
I've had a lot of them, and uh, I've had great fun dealing with new situations. I've had 2 experiences, for example, where I really took my show on the road. 2 different times I've been admitted pro hoc vice, which means for this case only, um, to handle first degree murder cases outside Florida. The first one, my friend Beth Tibbett called me one day and said, "Mike, I'm about to get hired on my first ever private pay first degree murder case. Will you help me?" Well, I've told you this before. Beth's significant other, the father of her 2 wonderful sons, is James Harrison, who at the time was a star linebacker for the Pittsburgh Steelers. So our conversation had something to do with, of course, I'll help you, Steelers tickets. I'd love to help you, Steelers tickets. When can I come up, Steelers tickets? Um, and we actually scheduled a couple of things so that I could come up there during Steelers home games. Um, the prosecutor in the case introduced himself to me. He was possibly the most Caucasian person I've ever met in my life. He introduced himself to me as Joe Green, and then he felt it necessary to say, "No relation." Of course, you remember Mean Joe Green from the Coke commercial. Um,
Sure.
he was one of the most fearsome players the Steelers ever had. Anyway, Beth brought me in, and we did some terrific lawyering in that case. And we actually got the first degree murder indictment dismissed. Our guy walked out of jail a free man without having to spend 5 minutes in a courtroom. The other case didn't turn out as well for us lawyers. Um, I was in Chicago at a seminar, um, and lawyers at seminars like to go out after class, DUI lawyers especially, and do what we call field research, which is we drink and we talk. And I was out in Chicago one evening with my friend Gretchen Taylor, who practices in Virginia just outside of DC. In fact, before my kids moved into their current home, Joe and Gabby lived in a town called Springfield, which is very close to Dulles Airport. And that's where Gretchen was living at the time, the same town. Town was called Chantilly. not Springfield, Chantilly. Anyway, I'm drinking and talking with Gretchen about this horrible murder case she's handling with this dull-witted client and co-counsel that was in over his head. And I started making suggestions. And rightly or wrongly, it seemed to Gretchen and me that the more we drank, the better my suggestions got. And one thing led to another, and she asked me if I would come in as third chair to help her and this other lawyer handle this case. I said, I gave her an even better deal because she couldn't come up with Steelers tickets. I agreed to work with her initially for travel expenses because I figured every time I went up there, I could see my kids and grandkids. The background of the case, it's a long story. I won't get into it today. It could be its own podcast. But for very specific righteous reasons, the first chair lawyer, not Gretchen, had to step aside. So Gretchen got promoted to first chair, and Gretchen and I worked out an agreement so that I came up to second chair. And we handled the case and we tried the case together. And if we could have just kept our client off the witness stand, we had a shot at winning. But he was the worst testifying client I've ever had in my life. I could tell his story way better than he could. And the benefit of me doing it at trial is, well, number one, I'm not under oath. And number two, I'm not subjected to cross-examination by the prosecutor. He told his story. He told it badly. He left out some of the details that would have helped him. So we had to prompt him to get him to do that, and it made it look like we were reminding him of a script. He was even worse on cross-examination. I, like a lot of lawyers, prefer not to put my client on because they have a tendency to utter things that are better left unuttered. This client changed his story on the witness stand, adding new details, and every new detail he added made his case worse, moved him farther away from the not guilty verdict. And I mean, I could have walked in the door as a stranger and cross-examined him and won that case. The district attorneys up there did a good job. They were very professional, very thorough, and the jury did the right thing. But that's one of the more memorable trials. I guess it sticks out because it's also one of the more recent. This was maybe, I don't know, 3-4 years ago, I think.
You know, that brings up a question that I would imagine a lot of people ask you. How do you take a case from someone that you know is guilty?
Oh, well, that's easy. That's easy. Everybody who's accused of anything is entitled to a fair trial. And it's my job to make sure they get one. It's much harder representing somebody that you know is not guilty. I can do a fantastic job on behalf of somebody who's actually guilty of the crime. And if the prosecutor and the police did a really terrific job, did their job the way they're supposed to, and they charge the right person, they should win. And I don't lose a lot of sleep over it as long as I don't lose the trial because of something I missed. Now, DUIs they're the hardest to handicap whether somebody's guilty or not guilty because DUIs are all circumstantial evidence. You know, we don't have any chemical testing before arrest, for example. So when the police charge somebody, they don't know what his or her blood or breath alcohol level is going to be. They don't even know if the person's going to submit to a test. And if they do submit to a test, it's typically taken at the jail or the police station maybe an hour later. So even then, it doesn't reflect what their alcohol level may have been when they were driving. It just reflects, if everything worked right, it reflects what their alcohol level was at the point they were tested. It's the cases where you know your client's not guilty that criminal defense lawyers have the hardest time with. You were here when we handled our recent case where our client was accused wrongfully of a hit and run. And the guy, she really hit him and she really didn't stop, but that's not the crime. The crime is knowingly leaving the scene of an accident. The standard to prove is that the driver knew or should have known that she hit a person and caused death or serious bodily injury. And the evidence was very clear from the beginning that she wasn't guilty of that. She wasn't arrested for 6 months after the fact. And we knew we were going to win the trial. We knew it all along, as long as the judge correctly instructed the jury, which he did. The police told the truth. We helped them. We thoroughly prepared the case, and it was the defense questioning that brought out the truth. But those are the kind of cases that are the hardest for anyone like me, any professional criminal lawyer to handle. Those are the ones we lose sleep over. We agonize over because this is where an innocent person could have their life ruined.
On a lighter note, as David Letterman used to call them, brushes with greatness. I know on Facebook, every time there's a celebrity that gets into any kind of legal trouble in Florida, somebody posts on your page to see if they hired you. Tiger Woods leaps to mind when he got into some difficulties a few years ago, probably more than a few. Are there any famous people? I'm sorry.
Tiger Woods got arrested for DUI in Jupiter. And for those of you not from around these parts, Jupiter is at the north end of Palm Beach County. I'm at the moment 2 counties north of there in St. Lucie County. I had friends and colleagues reaching out to me through text, email, phone calls, Facebook. Mike, are you going to represent Tiger Woods on his DUI? Well, shortly before Tiger had his problem, the Florida legislature passed a series of laws that we'll call an enabling act that authorized state attorneys to create a first-time offender diversion program for DUIs. But the legislature made it local option. So some state attorneys in some districts have it and some don't. Up here on the Treasure Coast, Martin, St. Lucie, Indian River, and Okeechobee counties, we do not have a first-time offender diversion program, but Palm Beach County does. So Tiger Woods didn't need a real DUI defender like me. Tiger needed somebody who could fog a mirror and find the courthouse. And if his lawyer could do those 2 things, he was going to get offered this first-time offender diversion program. And that's how that played out. Now, I have represented some famous people. I won a DUI case for a fellow named Dave Lubeck, who was the lead guitar player for Molly Hatchet. In fact, after I won the case, I sent in a press release that the local news ran word for word the way I wrote it, including the headline, which was Molly Hatchet guitarist no longer flirting with disaster. Flirting with disaster, of course, was probably their biggest hit, certainly one of their biggest hits. He was a great guy, treated me very well. Thing that I remember about that case is we won it on a motion to suppress. We went to court on a pretrial motion arguing that the officer didn't even have enough evidence to arrest him in the first place. And when a lawyer is going to go to court on one of those motions, the last thing he or she does before walking out of their office to go to court is they check their case law to see, are there any more recent cases that have come out that we need to know about? This hearing was set one afternoon, and at lunchtime I checked and I found a case from the Fourth District Court of Appeal, which is this part of Florida, that was factually identical to Mr. Lubeck's case. I mean, exactly on what we call all fours, exactly the same. And the case was decided 2 days before my hearing. So I was able to walk over to court with a trump card, an absolutely you can't lose this case card. And when it was my turn to make legal argument, I handed up the case to the judge and I said with a smile on my face, my trademark smile, I guess you could say, I'm sorry I don't have anything more recent, Judge. This case out of the Fourth District is from the day before yesterday. And the judge smiled and he looked at the case and he kept his poker face and he turned to the prosecutor and he said, this is kind of remote. Do you have anything more current than this? And of course, she didn't. And he dismissed the case. I also was lucky enough to represent a real baseball star. Miguel Cabrera. Miguel got a DUI, got accused of DUI here in Fort Pierce on his way to spring training. He lived in Fort Lauderdale and spring training was in Lakeland or Winter Haven. Was the Detroit Tigers. He became a star playing for the Marlins, but at some point they traded him to Detroit and he was a Detroit Tiger at the time. And when he got arrested for DUI, his agent called one of the top DUI lawyers in America who represents lots and lots of celebrities and also happens to be my good friend, the guy I wrote my book with, Bubba Head of Atlanta. And Bubba said, oh, you don't need a Miami lawyer. I know the guy for you. He's right in that town, right in Fort Pierce. So I represented Miguel Cabrera and we resolved his case well. And the day we were going to court to settle his case, his hearing was at 1:30 and he came up in the morning. And Miguel and I sat down in the diner in that building, in the Potbelly Deli, for 3 or 4 hours talking baseball, not talking about his case at all, talking a little bit about his family, a little bit about mine, but mostly talking about baseball. You know, because I've drummed it into your head since you were a little kid, my favorite baseball player, my hero, was Roberto Clemente. Well, Roberto was also Miguel's hero. And we talked a lot about Roberto Clemente. Miguel treated me great. He was genuinely a nice guy. I was not as fond of his agent because his agent kept tying my hands because he didn't want anything I did to make the papers. He was worried about what the Detroit papers might write. And I was more interested in getting our proof of innocence out to the local jury pool. So we were at odds, but Miguel generally did what his agent suggested he do, and that was probably in the long run for his best. I've represented some local politicians. I told you I represented one of our judges. I represented a county commissioner. I represented the vice mayor of the Sebastian City Council and quite a few other prominent people over the years. But that's the life of a criminal lawyer. You know, when word gets out that you know what you're doing, people call and people talk. And I've been lucky enough. I worked hard to become good at what I'm doing, and I've been lucky enough to do it mostly right here in Fort Pierce for all of these years.
Now, as we both have said, I think you've been here in the Treasure Coast for 40 years, and when most people hear that kind of thing, you think about businesses, you see it plastered on their walls and stuff, serving the Treasure Coast since blah 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 blah. But you have been a part of this community. You raised kids here, you own a home here, your dog's vet is here, your doctor, dentist are here. You go out to eat here, you shop here, you're a part of the community, and you have been for quite a while. And there's a good chance that most people at least know your name. What would you want them to know about you as a lawyer?
Wow, that's a good question. Um, we have we have nice knit shirts that we wear here from time to time that just say Kessler Law Firm, we defend. I want people to know I'm good at what I do. I work hard to remain good at what I do. My reputation in the legal community is probably that I'm the seminar guy. Most lawyers, the Florida bar requires a certain minimum amount of continuing legal education, and lawyers can handle that uh, nowadays, even online, but you can handle that by going to about a seminar a year. For the vast majority of my legal career, I've gone to a seminar a month. I even teach at a lot of seminars. 40 some years ago, I went to law school because I was done with math and science. Now, through study and work, I probably know more about forensic science than 99% of the lawyers in town. Um, I've gone to a lab in Chicago and taken a 40-hour class in a real laboratory learning how gas chromatography is done. That's the science that police labs use to analyze a blood sample to see, are there drugs in it, or is there alcohol in it, how much. Um, I've taken that series of classes 5 different times. So 5 different times I've gone to Chicago and spent a week there at my expense because I invest in my craft. For the last 6 years, I was one of the course directors of Florida's biggest DUI defense seminar because I like the opportunity to teach younger lawyers how to get better again at our craft. And I've always looked at this as becoming a craftsman. Dad taught me that. Dad taught me that in every profession, there are hacks, and you wonder how that they make a living at all. He said, there's the bottom 20% that you wonder why anybody ever hired him to do anything. Then there's the 70% that are competent, but no great shakes. You give them a winning case and they'll win. You give them a tough case and they probably won't. And then there's the craftsmen at the top. And the craftsmen are the people who not only win the cases they're supposed to, but can find a way to win the cases that maybe they're not supposed to. We won a few years ago a DUI manslaughter case where the initial police report said that the client I ended up representing at trial had T-boned a motorcycle, killing 2 people. And by the way, he had a blood alcohol level of 0.29, which is almost 4 times the legal limit. Well, through a lot of diligence, hard work, and not taking no for an answer, we ended up getting him found not guilty at trial of both counts of DUI manslaughter. And that was a case that most people would say, and most people did say when I first got involved, that this is a case you can't win. But we did. In fact, we did going away. By the time the case went to the jury, we were very confident that we had won. We had shown the jury that the blood alcohol test had to be wrong. We had shown the jury that the guy driving the motorcycle, it was a trike, a three-wheeler, that his blood alcohol level was over a 0.20, that he was going 70 miles an hour in a 35-mile-an-hour zone, coming uphill, leading a pack of other bikes at 10 o'clock at night, where it would have been virtually impossible for a driver facing down the hill to know how many vehicles were coming and at what speeds. And we presented an engineer who explained to the jury that 100% of people in our guy's position would have recognized that it was safe to make that turn. Unfortunately, what really had happened is the guy on the trike had passed all his buddies and was trying to beat our guy through the intersection like idiots try to beat a train through a crossing. And by the time we got to trial, we were able to show the jury that that's exactly what happened. And if the trike driver had lived, he would have been charged with DUI manslaughter for killing his passenger. I want people to know that we don't give up. We know that our job is to try to find a way to win and to give our clients the very best chance to win. That's what I want people to say about me. He's good at his job.
Very good. And that's a good place to leave it. Congratulations on 40 years.
Thank you very, very much. I guess that means that I started my career before you were born. That's what I'm going to tell Mom. Well, thank you all for joining us today for the Kessler Law Firm podcast. Whether you're watching this on YouTube or listening to it on your favorite podcasting site, please click subscribe or follow so the next time you come back, our latest podcast will be ready and waiting for you. If you'd like to know more about us, feel free to check out our website, www.kesslerlawfirm.com. And one last thing, yes, that is a beautiful bookcase behind me, but it's a background, and that's why the radio keeps popping up behind my head. The radio is real, and I'm mostly real, but the bookshelf behind me, not so much. Thanks again for joining us. See you again soon.